They divorced her for being barren, sent her west with a carpet bag and a label she never chose, worthless. She arrived at a stranger's ranch with nothing, no family, no future, no hope. But that frozen Wyoming winter was about to prove every doctor, every judge, every cruel whisper catastrophically wrong. What happened next defied medicine, logic, and everything she'd ever been told about herself. This story reminds us of something the Wyoming plains have always known. Your worth was never theirs to decide, and the life you build from the wreckage of their judgment can become the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. If that truth moves you, subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment with your city. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Stay until the end. You won't regret it.
The sun over Wyoming was just plain mean that September, baking the dirt to a fine dust. Clara held a handkerchief to her mouth while the wagon bucked and bounced. Next to her, a quiet old driver named Hutchkins spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Reckon that's the Hale place," he grunted, pointing at some shapes shimmering in the heat. Clara gripped her old travel bag, the one holding every last thing she owned in this world. It wasn't always like this. Just 3 months back, she had a nice home back in Philadelphia and a husband. 3 months back, she still had hope. The wagon groaned to a stop in front of a ranch house that looked like it was held together with pure grit. The barn leaned a little, and the chicken coop was propped against a tired old fence. Beyond it was just a whole lot of nothing but brown grass and distant purple mountains. "You certain about this, ma'am?" Hutchkins asked, like he already knew the answer. Clara hopped down before she could second-guess herself, her good city dress getting dusted up right away. She hadn't known what to bring. The letter was short and to the point. Housekeeper wanted, room and board plus $10 a month. Cooking, cleaning, no fuss. It wasn't much, but it beat the nothing she had after Richard's lawyer was done with her. The ranch door creaked open, and a man filled the doorway. He was big and still, moving with a purpose that said he never wasted a step. His face was tanned and lined from the sun, making it hard to put an age on him. 30, maybe, or 40. The prairie had a way of weathering a man. "Mrs. Whitmore?" His voice was low and gravelly. "Yes," Clara said, surprised at how steady she sounded. "Mr. Hale?" He just said, "Lucas Hale." He didn't offer a handshake, which was fine by her. Hutchkins went for her bag. "Just the one," she said. "I've got it." A little something crossed Lucas Hale's face, maybe respect. He gave a short nod. "Come on in. You'll be needing some water." The house inside was dark but clean, the kind of sparse that comes from a man living alone a long while. The main room was the kitchen and living room rolled into one. A big stove stood in the corner, and a rough wooden table with 2 chairs sat by the window. Lucas poured her a cup of water from a pitcher. It tasted like iron and wide-open spaces. "I'll show you to your room," he said. "Then we'll talk terms." The room was small, with a narrow bed and a washstand. A window looked out on what used to be a garden. Clara put her bag on the bed. Lucas stood in the doorway, keeping a polite distance. "The work's simple," he said. "Breakfast before the sun's up. I'm in the fields till sundown. Laundry once a week. The house needs a cleaning, but I ain't picky about when. I've been on my own for 3 years, so I know what's fair." Clara just nodded. "Anything you don't eat?" "I'll eat what's put in front of me, long as it's cooked." "And town?" "Redemption is 12 miles south. I go once a month for supplies. You can ride along." "I won't need much," Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment, not with judgment, just a tired sort of interest. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I don't know your story, and I ain't asking, but this is hard country. It breaks good people. If you're running, this might not be far enough. But if you're willing to work, I'll pay you fair and leave you be. That's the deal." For the first time in a long time, a knot in Clara's chest loosened. Peace, that sounded mighty good. "That's more than enough," she told him. Lucas gave his usual nod and left her to get settled. Clara sat on the little bed. Outside the window was nothing but sky and prairie. No nosy neighbors, no whispers behind her back. No Richard with his polite disappointment, and no mother-in-law with her snake-like sympathy. Poor Richard, married to a barren woman. She'd heard them. After 3 years and no baby, the doctors gave their verdict. Her body was just not made for it. Defective. That was the word that stuck. Richard's mother had been blunt. A wife's first duty is to provide an heir, she'd said. 6 weeks later, Richard filed for divorce. The law in Pennsylvania allowed it. Her own father, a tired and broken man, didn't put up a fight. The settlement was barely enough to get her out west. Go be useful somewhere, her own mother had told her, unable to look her in the eye. If you can't be a wife, you can at least be a servant. Clara stood and started to unpack. She had 2 other dresses, some underthings, and a hairbrush from her grandmother. She also had a small photograph of her little brother, Thomas, who'd died from scarlet fever when she was 12. She set his picture on the washstand. It was her only piece of decoration. Outside, she heard a hammer ringing on steel. Through the window, she saw Lucas working by the barn, his movements steady and sure. A man alone. A woman alone. It was a practical arrangement, and that was all. She'd cook and clean, and he would pay her. It was more of a chance than she had back in Philadelphia. That night, Clara got to work and made a simple supper from the supplies she found. She made supper with what she could find: salt pork, beans, and cornbread. Lucas came inside as the sun went down, washed his hands at the pump, and sat at the table without a word. Clara put a plate in front of him, then paused. "Should I eat in the kitchen?" she asked. Lucas looked up, truly surprised. "Why would you do that? The deal is you work here and live here. Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. This grub's getting cold." She sat, and they ate in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just new. When he was done, he took his plate to the wash basin. "You'll get the hang of the routine," he said. "Don't push yourself too hard at first." "I'll be fine," Clara answered. He stopped at the door to his room. "Sleep well, Mrs. Whitmore." "Clara," she said quickly. "You can call me Clara." He nodded. "Lucas, then. Good night, Clara." This was her life now, she thought later. This little room, this big empty ranch, this quiet man. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a girl, but it was hers. For the first time since her marriage fell apart, Clara had something that no one could take away. She blew out the lamp and listened to the wind blowing hard outside. Tomorrow would be an early day. She was going to earn her keep here, one chore at a time. Sleep came easy. The rooster had her up before the sun. The house was bone-chilling cold. Getting the stove lit was a real chore, and by the time she had flames going, she was sweating despite the chill. She put coffee on and started breakfast. Eggs, bacon, and biscuits she'd made the dough for the night before. Lucas came in as the sky turned gray. He poured his own coffee and sat down, just watching her work. "Biscuits might be a little heavy," Clara said, pulling them from the oven. "I'm still getting used to the altitude." "They'll do," Lucas said after taking a bite. He chewed for a moment. "My mama used to say a stove has to learn a new cook." It was the most he'd shared about himself. So, Lucas had a mother, a family somewhere. "I'll get it figured out soon enough," she said. They ate without much talk. Lucas finished his coffee and stood up. "I'm riding out to check the north fence. Won't be back till supper." He told her there was bread and cheese if she got hungry and that the chickens were already tended to. "Just gotta collect the eggs later. Watch out for the red hen. She's a mean one." And just like that, he was gone. Clara spent the morning looking around. The kitchen was stocked better than she figured, and it even had its own water pump inside. The house was small, but it was solid, built to stand up to the wind. It wasn't fancy like her old life in Philadelphia, but it felt like a fresh start. less to maintain, and a whole lot less to prove. In the afternoon, she went to the chicken coop. She got 6 eggs, and Lucas was right about that red hen. The dang bird pecked her hand good before she could get the eggs. Past the ranch house, the prairie just went on forever. Clara walked out a little ways, feeling the big, empty space around her. The wind pulled at her dress and her hair. The sky was a bright, perfect blue. For a second, she felt real small, like she didn't matter at all to the huge landscape around her. Instead of being scary, it felt like freedom. The first week flew by. Clara learned Lucas was an early riser who worked till dark and didn't say much unless he had to. He was always polite, but kept to himself. She got into the rhythm of the ranch, from feeding chickens to doing laundry in a big copper tub on Mondays. That ranch work was tougher than Clara ever figured. Her hands, once soft from city life, were now cracked and blistered. Her back ached something fierce from the washboard. But she kept her complaints to herself, knowing they did no good. At least here, her hard work showed. Lucas noticed the small things. The coffee tasted better, he said one morning. From a man like him, that was high praise. On her second Saturday, Lucas said he was heading to the town of Redemption for supplies. He told her she was welcome to join him. Clara had no one to write letters to, but seeing town sounded good. They left Sunday in the wagon. The road was just a couple of ruts in the prairie. Clara found herself asking how long he had lived out here. 8 years, he said. He bought the land with money from his railroad days and built the house himself. It was a solid place. Lucas then said she did not have to talk if she did not want to. He admitted he was not much for conversation. Clara told him she was fine with the quiet. A hint of a smile touched his eyes. That makes 2 of us, he said. Redemption was a small cluster of wooden buildings. Lucas pulled up to the general store and helped her down. Inside, the owner, a man named Davidson, greeted Lucas. He gave Clara a curious look. "This must be your new housekeeper," he said. Lucas introduced her as Mrs. Whitmore, saying she would be handling the shopping now. While Clara gathered her supplies, Mrs. Davidson watched her. "You are from back east," she stated. It was not a question. "Pennsylvania," Clara replied. "That is a long way to come for this kind of work." Clara looked her straight in the eye. "It is a long way from anywhere to anywhere out here, isn't it?" The woman seemed surprised, then offered a little respect. "Welcome to Redemption," she said. As they were leaving, a young woman with a baby on her hip called out to Lucas. Her name was Sarah. Lucas went completely still before turning around. He asked how she was. She said she was managing and introduced her son, Matthew. Sarah's eyes moved from Clara back to Lucas. "I heard you hired some help." Lucas introduced Clara. Sarah looked Clara over, then said Lucas was a good man, just kept to himself too much. Lucas's tone was a clear warning when he said her name. Sarah said her goodbyes and left. Lucas climbed back on the wagon without a word. Miles passed before Clara spoke, saying she was sorry if she caused a problem. "It was not your concern," he said, his jaw tight. He made it clear he did not want to talk about it. Back at the ranch, Lucas unloaded the wagon with a grim energy. When dinner was ready, he did not come inside. Clara found him in the barn, messing with a harness that was not broken. "Dinner is ready," she said. He told her he was not hungry. "I made pot roast," Clara stated quietly. "I need you to eat it, because if you do not, all my work was for nothing." He finally stopped and set the harness down. "Sarah and I were supposed to be married," he said. 3 years ago, she married Morrison, the banker, instead. He had better prospects." Clara just nodded. "Well," she said, "I am only here to keep your house and earn my pay." That seemed to be the right thing to say. A bit of the tension left him. "Good," he said. "Now come eat before this pot roast gets cold." He followed her back, and while they ate in silence, something between them had eased. By October, Clara had found her rhythm. Her hands were tough and the house ran smoothly. Even Lucas had started to relax. He was still a quiet man, but he would make small talk about the weather or supplies. One evening, he offered her any book from his small shelf. She found a surprising mix of ranching guides and classic novels. She started reading one by the lamplight. Lucas noted it was a good choice, and that he had noticed she liked a challenge. He said it with a hint of amusement that surprised her. Winter came on fast and hard. "A big storm is coming," Lucas warned, looking at the sky. They worked together, bringing in extra water and firewood. Have you ever been dealt a bad hand, feeling like you lost everything that mattered? Well, that was Clara's story. A woman from the big city, chewed up and spit out into the middle of Wyoming with nothing to her name. Just when she figured things couldn't get worse, a real monster of a blizzard hit. The wind howled something awful. She found Lucas inside, feeding wood to the stove. For 3 whole days, that storm was their entire world. They settled into a quiet rhythm, working side by side like they'd done it for years. And in those long, quiet hours, they really talked. He told her about growing up, and she found herself sharing things about her family back east. For the first time in a long while, it all felt strangely comfortable. On the 3rd night, he taught her how to play a card game called 7-Up. Before long, he was teasing her. "You're a card sharp, ain't you?" Clara just gave a little smile. A lady never tells her secrets. Lucas got real quiet then. A lady don't usually clean another man's house for wages either. The words just hung there in the lamplight. Her smile vanished. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I suppose she doesn't." Lucas set down his cards. "Clara, I didn't mean to. It's all right. You are right. I am not a lady anymore." "That is where you are wrong," he said, his voice as steady as an old oak. "Circumstances don't define a person. And I reckon you're more of a lady than most I have ever met." He looked her straight in the eye and told her that whoever made her feel small was a fool and dead wrong. Clara's eyes started to sting, and she had to look down at her cards to hide it. The next morning broke clear and bitter cold. After they dug out the barn, Clara stood for a moment looking at the ranch buried in quiet white. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a deep sense of peace. It felt like this was home. November arrived a few weeks later. Clara was learning the land's language now, reading the sky for signs of the weather. Then one Tuesday morning, a terrible sound ripped through the quiet air. It was a high, awful squeal of a horse in pure terror. She dropped the water buckets and ran as fast as she could. One of the workhorses, a big fella named Samson, had gotten himself tangled up bad in a rope. He was panicking, kicking and pulling, making it worse with every move. Blood was already staining his leg. Lucas was way out in the pasture, too far to be any help. Her heart was pounding like a drum, but she didn't hesitate. She climbed right over that fence. "Easy now, boy," she said, her voice calm and low. "Easy now, Samson. Nobody's gonna hurt you." The horse's eyes were rolling white with fear. She kept on talking to him, real soft and slow, inching her way closer. "That's it. We're gonna get you free." Finally, she was close enough to lay a hand on his trembling shoulder. Claire kept up her soothing talk while her other hand worked on that tight, twisted rope. Her fingers were getting torn up, but she didn't stop, just a little more. And then the rope came free. Samson exploded backward, knocking her flat on her back in the dirt. For a second, all she saw was the big Wyoming sky. Then Lucas was there, dropping to his knees beside her. "Clara, are you hurt? Talk to me." "I'm fine," she managed, wincing. "I just fell." He looked her over, his big hands surprisingly gentle. "You could have been killed." He shook his head. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen." She gave a weak smile. "Can't it be both?" He helped her to her feet, his hands lingering on her arms just a moment longer than they had to. Back in the kitchen, Lucas insisted on tending to her hands himself. The rope had torn them up pretty bad. He poured whiskey over the raw cuts to clean them. "This is going to sting," he warned. "It already does," she said softly. She watched his face as he worked, seeing the deep worry in his eyes. He had been truly scared for her. "I am sorry I worried you," she said. Lucas didn't look up. "You did not worry me." He wrapped her hand in a clean cloth. Then his eyes met hers. "All right," he finally admitted. "You worried me." He stood up then, his shoulders tense. "A horse can be replaced, Clara." His voice went low and serious. "You can't." The meaning of his words settled in the quiet room, heavy and true. Clara tried to make a light comment about good help being hard to find, but she knew and he knew that was not what he meant at all. "That is not what I meant, I know." He turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. This was a dangerous line they were crossing. For months they had been so careful to keep a proper distance. He was the boss and she was the help. But Clara suspected it had become something more weeks ago. In quiet moments, neither of them had noticed. "I ought to check on Samson," Lucas said at last. "Yes, of course." He walked out, and Clara sat by herself in the kitchen, staring at her hands. Her heart was still pounding, but no longer from her trouble with the horse. What was she doing getting attached to this place and this man? It was the biggest kind of foolishness. She had come here simply to work and to survive. That evening, Lucas was quieter than he usually was. He ate the stew she had made, but his eyes kept going to the dark window. "The horse will be fine," Clara said. "The cuts were not as bad as they looked." "I know. I cleaned his leg myself." "Then what is bothering you?" Lucas put down his fork. "I have been thinking." A small smile touched her lips. "Always a dangerous thing. Sarah Morrison stopped by while you were in town last week." Clara's stomach felt tight. What did she want? "She was asking about you, about our arrangement here." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you are my housekeeper." He paused. "She said that people in town are talking." Of course they were. A single man and a single woman living in the same house. Back in Philadelphia, it would have been a scandal. Wyoming was no different. "Let them talk," Clara said with more heat than she meant to. "We know the truth." "Do we?" The question hung between them like a challenge. "What are you asking me, Lucas?" "I do not know." He walked to the window and back again. "When I hired you, things were simple. I needed help. You needed a job. That was all there was to it. And now, well, now it is not simple anymore." Clara's throat felt dry. "No, I suppose it is not." Lucas stopped his pacing and looked down at her. "I am not a man who is good with words, Clara. But I need you to understand what you have done. You have made this house feel like a home. You made me feel less lonely." He struggled for a moment. "I value you, not just for your work. You. I hope you know that." Clara could not find her voice. A feeling she thought was buried forever was waking up inside her chest. "I know," she finally said. "Good." He nodded just once, as if they had settled a deal. Then he left her alone with her thoughts. The next weeks passed with a strange new feeling in the air. Clara found herself noticing things about Lucas she had not before. The sound of his step, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention. They did not speak of it, but the air between them was thick with things they did not say. December brought a deep cold. Their world shrank to the warm kitchen and their simple routines. In the evenings, Lucas started reading Moby Dick out loud to her. "Call me Ishmael," he read, his deep voice filling the quiet. This was contentment, she thought. She had never known such a thing in her marriage. Her husband, Richard, had been proper and polite, but always far away. He never looked at her like she was something worth protecting. On Christmas Eve, Lucas surprised her with a small pine branch in a jar, decorated with red fabric. "It is not much," he said, looking a little embarrassed. But it seemed wrong to let the day go by. "They are pieces from a shirt I mended," she realized. "It is perfect. I have something for you, too." He pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. "It is not anything fancy." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a pair of soft leather gloves, made to protect hands from rope and cold. Lucas, I cannot take these. Yes, you can. You need them for your work. But the look in his eyes said it was not about work at all. Thank you. She pulled them on, and they fit like they were made for her. I have something for you too, she said. She went to her room and came back with a scarf she had been knitting in secret. Lucas unfolded it and touched the soft wool. You made this. It is not much. It is everything. He wrapped it around his neck, and the tenderness of it made her breath stop. Thank you, Clara. He took a step toward her. His hand came up and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Clara, he said softly, I need to tell you something. She was sure he could hear her heart beating. What is it? I am not good at this, feelings and words, but you ought to know. Just then, a hard knock on the door broke the spell. They jumped apart like children who had been caught. Lucas's jaw set hard. Stay here, he told her. But she followed him to the door. A young man stood on the porch, shivering from the cold and snow. Mr. Hale, I am so sorry to bother you on Christmas, but there has been an accident at the Morrison place. Their barn roof fell in. The bank manager is trapped under it. We are getting every man who can help dig him out. Lucas did not hesitate. Let me get my coat. He was gone in a few minutes. Clara stood alone with the little tree and the echo of what he had almost said. He did not come back until late that night. He looked worn out and grim, and she saw blood on his hands. Is he alive? She asked. Barely. His leg is crushed. The doctor says he will probably lose it. Lucas sat down hard. I have never seen Sarah like that. Hysterical. Clara put coffee in front of him. You have to eat. When he was done, he stood up. I am going to bed. Tomorrow I will ride back to see if there is more I can do. Lucas. Clara reached out and took his arm as he turned to go. For a week, Lucas was a ghost, gone at dawn and back after dark, wrestling with something heavy. The whole town knew the Morrisons were in a bad way. The man was crippled, bills were piling up, and they were about to lose it all. Clara mostly saw his worried shadow until New Year's Eve. He walked into the kitchen looking grim. We need to talk. Those words always spelled trouble. Sarah came by, he said, sitting down. Morrison might lose his leg, or worse. The bank is calling their note. He paused. She asked for money. A loan, she called it, but we both know better. What did you say? That I would think on it. He met her gaze. Clara, I have the money. It is for the ranch expansion, but I have it. It would not break me, he admitted, but you are not sure you should. She chose Morrison for his prospects, he said, his voice hard. Now they are gone, and she is asking for a handout. A part of me wants to let her live with her choice. But that is not the part that is keeping you up at night, Clara said softly. No. The other part remembers her being scared and just trying to protect her child. That part says I have to help. Then you have your answer. Do I? You are a good man, Lucas. You will do what is right no matter the cost. It is who you are. His face changed. But if I give her the money, there is no expansion. It means I cannot offer you more than this. He took her hands. This was a simple job, but for me it has changed. I need to know if it has for you, too. Her heart pounded. This was it. She could pull back or step forward. Yes, she whispered, it has. Relief washed over his face. Then I have to tell you something. About why I really hired you. Her gut clenched. What are you talking about? The agency letter, he said, struggling. It mentioned your divorce. The reason. She flushed with anger. They should not have. Please, just listen. After Sarah, I swore off marriage, swore off family. It was too much to risk again. So when they mentioned your situation, I thought you would be safe. No complications, no feelings. He held on tight as she tried to pull away. I was a fool, Clara. I was wrong about everything. I do not want to be safe anymore. I want you. Not as my housekeeper. I want you as my wife. My partner. The world spun. You cannot be serious. Never been more serious. But Lucas, I cannot have children. You know that. I do not care. You will, she choked out. Clara! He held her face, making her look at him. Listen, I do not need children. I need you, your strength, the way you make this place a home. I just need to not be alone anymore. That is all I need. Tears ran down her cheeks. I am broken, Lucas. Then everyone who told you that is a fool, he said, his voice like steel. You are the strongest woman I know. Your worth is not some doctor's opinion. She saw he meant every word. He was not asking in spite of her past, but because of who she was now. Yes, she whispered, laughing through her tears. Yes, I will marry you. The kiss that followed felt like pure hope, washing away all the old shame. Afterward, he rested his forehead on hers. I am still going to help Sarah. But after that, I am only looking forward, with you. With me, she agreed. They married 3 weeks later, a simple affair at the ranch. That night he held her and said, I love you, Clara Hale. A new name for a new life. I love you too, she whispered back into the warm, quiet dark. The prairie wind could howl all it wanted. She was finally home. Marriage did not change the daily chores, but it changed everything else. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Claire now woke to the steady sound of Lucas breathing beside her. At meals, his hand would find hers, a silent message of comfort. When the February thaw turned the yard to mud, a sudden dizzy spell sent her grabbing for the kitchen sink. She told herself it was just fatigue. But soon, a strange queasiness took hold. The smell of cooking made her stomach turn. When Lucas came in that evening, he found her pale and clutching a cup of cold tea. He felt her forehead instantly. Clara, you have a fever. She insisted she was fine, just feeling a bit off. You are sick, he said firmly. Go to bed. I will handle the cooking. His tone left no room for argument. Lucas tucked her into bed with a surprising tenderness. He brought her cool water and a cloth for her head, ordering her to sleep. The next morning, a note from him said, Rest. I will handle everything. For 3 more days, the sickness came and went. Mornings were the worst. Plain food seemed to help. Then, on the 4th morning, as she nibbled on dry toast, the truth hit her with the force of a prairie storm. She started counting the days in her head. It had been 6 weeks, almost 7. The toast fell from her trembling hands. It couldn't be. 3 different doctors had said the same thing. They told her having a child was nearly impossible. No, she whispered to the quiet kitchen, it is impossible. But she had missed her monthly cycle for almost 7 weeks. Her body was telling her a different story. She kept the secret to herself. The hope was too new, too easy to break. Her first husband, Richard, had always pointed out every false hope, every disappointment. She would not let that happen again. She hid the sickness from Lucas, blaming the long winter for her pale face. He noticed, of course. Lucas saw everything. He just thought she was working too hard. You do not have to prove anything to me, he would say gently. But Clara could not rest. Resting meant thinking about the impossible thing that might be true. March blew in with its last bitter winds. Clara's body kept changing in small ways. Her skirts were getting snug around her waist. Her appetite was a mystery. One day starving, the next unable to eat. She knew she could not hide it much longer. But how could she tell Lucas? How do you explain a miracle that doctors swore could never happen? The answer arrived on a blustery Tuesday in the form of Mrs. Davidson from the general store. She came to deliver fabric, but really, Clara knew, she came to see the newlyweds. Mrs. Davidson settled at the table, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the home. You have made this place quite cozy, she said. Lucas was living like a bear in a cave before you got here. Living and just getting by are 2 different things, the older woman said, sipping her coffee. My husband says Lucas seems happier than he has in years. That suits him, and you too, I think. Mrs. Davidson's gaze grew sharper. Though you are looking a little worn out, child. Are you feeling all right? Just tired, Clara answered. Mrs. Davidson's eyes stayed on her. You know, I have birthed 7 of my own and helped deliver nearly 30 more out here. I know the signs when I see them. Clara's teacup clattered in its saucer. I think you know what I mean, Mrs. Davidson said softly. How far along are you? I am not, Clara started, but the denial felt useless. Because it is impossible. The doctors were very clear. Mrs. Davidson snorted. Doctors, what do they know? Clara took a slow breath. But what if they were right? Then you have the most convincing false symptoms I have ever seen, Mrs. Davidson said, leaning forward. Listen to me. I have been doing this for 30 years. You, my dear, are definitely carrying a child. The words seemed to make the room stand still. I am scared, Clara whispered. Of course you are. First babies are always scary, Mrs. Davidson said, covering Clara's hand with her own. But you are strong. You will handle this. But what if something goes wrong? Then we will handle it. That is what women do. But Lucas needs to know. That is what a marriage is for, facing things together. You tell him today. Do not carry this by yourself for one more minute. After she left, Clara's hand went to her stomach. Could it really be true? A strange new feeling was growing inside her, defying every doctor. She thought of Richard's cold anger, his mother's cruel words about barren women. The thought of them seeing her now brought a sharp, satisfying smile. Lucas came in at sunset and saw her expression. What is it? He asked, his own face tight with worry. Are you leaving me? No, she said, the words tumbling out. I am pregnant. He froze. What? About 2 months, I think. Mrs. Davidson was here, and she is sure of the signs, and I have been sick every morning. Lucas cut her off with a fierce, sudden kiss. When he pulled back, his eyes were shining with tears. Are you sure? He whispered. I do not know, she said, breathless. But my body and Mrs. Davidson, they seem to be. The doctors. Damn the doctors. Lucas pulled her in, holding her so tight she could hardly breathe. Damn every single one of them, he said. Clara felt her own tears fall. You're not angry? He let out a laugh that was shaky but full of joy. Angry? Clara, I ain't even got the words for what I'm feeling. Scared to death, amazed, happy, but not angry. Never. I didn't think it was possible. Well, I reckon we're in the business of doing impossible things. He pulled back to look at her. You're going to be all right. We'll make sure of it. I'm taking you to the doctor in Redemption tomorrow. What if he says the same thing? Then we'll find another one, and another, till we find a man who knows what he's talking about. He looked determined. But I have a feeling Mrs. Davidson knows more about birth and babies than half the doctors out here. If she says you're carrying our child, then you are. Our child. The words settled over her like a warm blanket. I'm scared, Lucas. I'm scared. I know, he said, pressing his forehead against hers. Me too. But we'll do it together. That was the promise, remember? A new life was starting inside her. A life that 3 doctors in Philadelphia said could never exist. She thought about the broken woman she was when she first got to Wyoming. That woman never would have believed a moment like this was possible. But that woman had learned to mend fences, calm a spooked horse, and read the weather in the sky. She'd learned that being strong wasn't about not having fear. It was about refusing to let fear win. The next morning, Lucas insisted they go to Redemption. The town doctor, a tired-looking man named Fletcher, examined Clara while Lucas paced outside like a nervous cat. After the exam, Dr. Fletcher looked at her. Well, Mrs. Hale, I don't know what those doctors in Philadelphia told you, but far as I can see, you're about 10 to 12 weeks pregnant. The room felt like it was tilting. You're certain? As certain as I can be without delivering the baby myself, he said. Were you told you couldn't have children? Multiple doctors confirmed it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Did they give you a reason? Clara tried to explain their complicated words. Dr. Fletcher's face grew skeptical. Mrs. Hale, I will shoot straight. A lot of what doctors say, especially about women's bodies, is pure guesswork. A woman is built tough. What they called abnormal was just their opinion. Plain and simple, they were wrong, because you are pregnant. Now, we need to keep you and this baby safe. What are the risks? She asked. He was blunt. Childbirth is always a risk out here. And this is your first. How old are you? 28. That is fine. But you must be careful. Good food and plenty of rest. I need to see you each month and then weekly toward the end. Do you have any folks to help with the birth? Clara thought of her distant mother. No, sir, no one. Mrs. Davidson is a good midwife. I suggest you hire her. She is better at the birthing part, and I am better if there are complications. The word complications hung in the air. What should I expect? He explained the stages of pregnancy, and Clara felt both prepared and terrified. One last thing, he added gently. Do not borrow trouble. Most babies arrive healthy. Focus on that. When Clara came out, Lucas jumped up. He says it is true. 10 to 12 weeks. A huge grin spread across Lucas's face. He swept her up in a big hug. Careful, she laughed. You weigh nothing, he said, setting her down gently. A summer baby. His smile was pure joy. We are going to have a summer baby. Heading home, Clara watched her husband. He had been quiet, but in a good way. He kept reaching for her hand. What is on your mind? She asked. Just thinking, he said. About building a cradle, making a nursery. I need to fix up the house, make it warmer for the winter. Lucas, it is only March. I know, but there's a lot to get done. He looked at her, his eyes full of purpose. I want everything to be perfect for you and the baby. Her heart swelled. It just needs to be safe, Lucas. It will be both, he promised. As they rode, the morning sickness returned, but this time it felt different. It felt like hope. I cannot believe it is happening, she whispered. Lucas squeezed her hand. Believe it. You are going to be a mama. The words finally broke her, and tears streamed down her face. Lucas stopped the wagon and held her tight as she cried into his shoulder. What if I am no good at it? She cried. What if I do not know how? You will learn, he said softly, just like you learned everything else out here. Remember when you could not even light the stove? He grinned. Now you are the best cook around. A baby is not a stove. True, he teased. Babies cry less when you forget to feed them. He wiped her tears away. Clara, you are the strongest woman I know. You will be a wonderful mother. I do not have a single doubt. She held on to his words, needing to believe him. The fear of failing was just too much to bear. Together, she whispered. As spring bloomed across the prairie, her belly grew. Everything changed, and her body ached in new ways. Lucas worried over her constantly, trying to do everything for her. I am pregnant, not helpless, she finally told him, grabbing a laundry basket. The doctor said The doctor said no heavy work, Lucas, not that I was made of glass, but he worried something fierce. Lucas turned an old storage room into a beautiful nursery, even building a cradle from wood he had saved for years. He put in a new window to catch the morning sun. Our neighbor, Mrs. Davidson, would stop by, mostly to make sure Lucas had not driven me plumb crazy with his fretting. She always had good, plain talking advice. That man will calm down when he is holding his baby, she told me one afternoon. First-time fathers are the jumpest critters on earth. He is just scared because you are carrying his whole world inside you. But she got serious then. Clara, you listen. Having a baby out here is hard work. You are going to need to be stronger than you have ever been. I told her I was scared. She nodded. Good. A little fear keeps you smart. Just do not let it own you. When the time comes, your body knows the way. You just have to trust it. But how could I trust a body that 3 doctors told me was broken? Then one sunny morning in May, I felt it. A tiny flutter, like butterfly wings on the inside. I froze right there, my hand flying to my belly. Then I felt it again. It was real. Life. "Lucas!" I yelled. "Come here, quick!" He came running, shovel in his hands, his face pale with fear. "What is it? Are you all right?" I just grabbed his calloused hand and pressed it to my stomach. "Just wait," I whispered. For a second, nothing happened. Then his eyes went wide as dinner plates. Was that it? Was that the baby? When it happened again, his face just lit up with pure wonder. "That is our child," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child in there," I whispered to my belly. "Say hello to your daddy." The baby gave a little kick in reply. Lucas dropped to his knees in the dirt, pressing his ear against me, and I ran my fingers through his hair, filled with a love so big it almost hurt. "Fine," Lucas reminded her. He often knelt to feel the baby move. "It is a miracle," he would say, tears sometimes in his eyes. "You are a miracle." The summer heat was brutal, making Clara feel heavy and tired. She would sit in the shade, knitting and wondering about the baby. Would it look like her or Lucas? And would she be a good mother? That question never left her mind. At her July checkup, Dr. Fletcher had news. "You are measuring mighty big," he said. "Could just be a large baby. Or maybe twins." Twins. The word nearly stopped her heart. "It is possible," he said. "We will not know for sure until the big day." The thought of 2 babies was terrifying. But this whole journey had felt impossible from the start. August came with heavy, hot storms. Clara was miserable and ready. The baby, or babies, never seemed to rest, keeping her up all night. Lucas started reading to her belly, hoping to calm them down. "You all settle down now," he would say to her belly. "Your mama needs some sleep." "I do not think they are listening," she would reply. "Then they take after you. Stubborn from day one." She had to laugh. "I am not stubborn. You are the most stubborn woman in these parts," he said with a smile, "and I love you for it." Then, on a hot August afternoon, it happened. Clara was on the porch when a deep tightening seized her belly. It was nothing like the practice ones. This was real. She waited. 20 minutes later, it came again, stronger this time. There was no doubt. The baby was on its way. She stood up slowly. "Lucas," she called, her voice surprisingly calm. "You had better go get Mrs. Davidson. It is time." Lucas went pale. He dropped his tools and stared for a second before sprinting for the barn. "I will get the wagon," he yelled. "Do not you move!" Another contraction hit, and Clara breathed through it, just like she had been taught. That ride to town was the longest of my life. Lucas pushed the horses hard, but every rut in the road sent a jolt of pain right through me. "We are almost there," he kept saying, his voice tight with worry. I told him, "Lucas, first babies take their sweet time. We are all right." Mrs. Davidson took one look at my face when we pulled up and immediately took over. She sent Lucas to fetch the doctor and gave him a list of chores just to keep him busy. Then she helped me inside. "How far apart are the pains?" she asked. "About 15 minutes now." "Good," she said, her hands gently feeling my belly. "The baby feels like it is in the right spot." I told her Dr. Fletcher thought it might be twins. Her hands stopped moving for a second. "Well, I will be," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "He might be right. I feel 2 little ones in here." The thought of 2 babies hit me like a ton of bricks. "Can I do this?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. Mrs. Davidson looked me straight in the eye. "Honey, you can do anything you set your mind to. This is going to be a long night, though." And she was right. The pains kept coming all afternoon and into the evening. They grew stronger, steadier. Dr. Fletcher arrived and confirmed it. "2 babies for sure," he said. "You are in for a challenge, Mrs. Hale." Lucas sat by my bed the whole time, holding my hand through every wave of pain. "You are doing so good," he would say. "You are the bravest woman I know." As the night wore on, the pain got worse, stealing my breath. Sometime after midnight, my water broke with a sudden gush. "That is progress," Mrs. Davidson said cheerfully. "Things will move faster now." And they sure did. The pains came one on top of the other, and I lost all track of time. My whole world shrank down to the work my body was doing, with Lucas's hand holding mine through it all. Clara squeezed Lucas's hand so hard she was sure to leave a mark. "I am sorry," she panted through a wave of pain. "Don't you dare say sorry. You break my whole hand if it helps you." Morning light finally slipped through the window. Clara was worn clean out, drenched and aching in every muscle. But the babies weren't coming yet. "How much longer?" she asked Mrs. Davidson. "Hard to say, dear. First ones take their own sweet time, and you've got 2. The woman gently wiped Clara's brow. An hour passed, then another. The pain was a living thing inside her. She heard herself making animal sounds she did not recognize. "I cannot do it," she cried in a moment of peace. "I cannot do this." "Yes, you can," Lucas said, his voice fierce. "You're the strongest woman I know. You came here with nothing and made a life. You can do this." "It hurts so much." "I know. I wish I could take it for you." "You cannot," she said, gripping him as the pain returned. "I have to do this myself. Do this. You are not by yourself. I am right here." Later that morning, Mrs. Davidson checked her again. "All right, you're ready. On this next one, you need to push." The word push felt a world away. Mrs. Davidson's voice cut through her exhaustion. "Clara, listen. When the pain comes, bear down. Your babies are ready for your help." The next wave built, and Clara pushed with a strength she did not know she had. The pressure was more than she could imagine. A scream tore from her throat. "That's it," Mrs. Davidson coached. "That's good. Do it again." The work went on forever. Time disappeared. There was only the need to get these babies out. Lucas never left her side, his calm voice a lifeline through each wave. "I see ahead," the doctor said. "One more big push, Mrs. Hale." Clara gave it everything she had left. The pressure was unbearable, and then suddenly it was gone. A tiny, fierce cry filled the room. "It is a boy," Mrs. Davidson announced, holding up a little red baby. Clara fell back, tears of relief running down her face. A son. But it was not over. Another pain seized her. "The second one is on its way," the doctor said. "I know you are tired, Clara, but we need to work fast." The second birth was quicker, but just as hard. 3 more pushes, her body working on its own will now, then another release. A second cry joined the first. "Another boy," Mrs. Davidson said, her voice full of feeling. "Twin boys, Clara. 2 fine, healthy sons." Clara was speechless, her body feeling hollowed out. Then Mrs. Davidson laid the babies on her chest. They were warm and wiggling and real. She looked at them through her tears. They were tiny and perfect. "You did it," Lucas whispered, his own face wet with tears. "Clara, you did it." She had. She had done the impossible. The thing they said her broken body could never do. 2 perfect little lives were resting on her chest. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, my sons." The doctor and Mrs. Davidson confirmed they were both healthy, weighing around 6 pounds each with strong lungs. Mrs. Davidson wrapped them in soft blankets and handed them back. "You should try to feed them now," she said gently. "It will help you." Nursing was harder than the books made it sound. The babies seemed just as lost as she was. The tiny mouth finally found its purpose, latching on with a surprising grip. The feeling was new, a mix of pain and profound rightness. Lucas just sat on the bed's edge, his face filled with a wonder that made Clara's heart ache. He whispered, "We have sons. I cannot believe we have 2 sons." Clara had been thinking on it. "I would like to name them for my father, James, and my grandfather, William." Lucas spoke the names aloud. "James Hale and William Hale. Those are good, strong names." She added, "Thomas for a middle name, after my brother." Lucas reached out and let a tiny hand wrap around his finger. The next few hours were a tired, happy blur. Mrs. Davidson showed her how to tell them apart. James had a small mark on his shoulder and William had a funny cowlick. The doctor told her to rest for a month. Clara worried about the ranch, but Lucas promised to handle it all. Her only job was to heal and care for their boys. Rest was a dream with two hungry babies. James was the peaceful one, but William was fussy and always seemed to be starving. Clara's days became a cycle of feeding, changing, and catching a few moments of sleep. Lucas, however, was a complete surprise. He stepped up like he had been a father his whole life. He changed diapers, rocked a crying William for hours, and even built a second cradle. One night, as he soothed William like an old pro, Clara had to ask, "Where did you learn to do all this?" He got a faraway look. "I helped with my sister's 3 babies before she passed, a long time ago." It was the first she had ever heard about a sister. There were still parts of his life she did not know, but now they had a lifetime to learn them. Mrs. Davidson came by that first week bringing diapers and good advice. On her last visit, she declared them all to be thriving. After she left, Clara rocked William while James slept. The evening sun cast a golden glow across the room. Lucas came in from his work, tired and dusty, but his face lit right up when he saw his family. He asked how the boys were. "William is still fussy. James slept all afternoon." Lucas washed up and sat with her. "Samson threw a shoe. I need to ride to the blacksmith tomorrow." "Take the babies with you," Clara said. "Let people see them." Lucas looked surprised. "Into town? Are they old enough?" "They are 3 weeks old," she replied. "And Mrs. Davidson says half of Redemption wants to meet the Miracle Twins." Lucas chuckled. "Is that what they are calling them?" Clara smiled. "Seems the story of the barren woman having twins is big news." He stroked William's head. "Let them talk. As long as our boys are healthy, I do not care what anyone says." A week later, they made the trip. Clara put on her best dress, and Lucas made a soft nest of blankets in the wagon for the boys. Redemption looked the same, but it felt different to Clara now that she was a mother. The town's welcome was a warm and noisy thing. People came from every direction to peek at the babies and clap Lucas on the shoulder. "They are beautiful," a woman said. Then Sarah Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, with little Matthew on her hip. She looked older, with new lines of worry on her face. Her husband had lost his leg, and times were hard for them. For a long moment, the two women just looked at each other. Then Sarah stepped closer. "May I see them?" she asked in a low voice. Clara nodded toward the wagon. Sarah stared at the sleeping infants. "They are perfect," she said at last. "You are very lucky." Their eyes met, and in that moment there was an understanding. Sarah had chosen what she thought was a safe life and lost it. Clara had accepted a life of uncertainty and gained everything. "Lucas is a good man," Sarah said. "I am glad he found happiness." Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Lucas came to Clara's side, his eyes full of concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I truly am." They finished their errands and had lunch with Mrs. Davidson. On the ride home, Clara felt a deep sense of peace she had never known. The babies slept, and Lucas held her hand. The wide prairies stretched out all around them, golden in the sun. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that my life is impossibly better than anything I ever dared to imagine." The months passed in a blur of joy and exhaustion. The boys grew quickly, their little personalities starting to shine through. James was the quiet watcher, and William was a whirlwind of motion and sound. Clara's body healed, and the deep tiredness of childbirth was replaced by the everyday weariness of raising children. She did not mind one bit. A fierce pride swelled in her chest every time she looked at her sons. Lucas was a full partner in everything. He took his turn in the dead of night, bringing the babies to Clara to be fed. He even built them a bigger table to keep the cradles nearby while they ate. One day, Clara teased him as he made a toy from wood scraps. "You are going to spoil them." He just smiled. You cannot spoil children with love and attention. When the first winter storms hit, the little house felt warmer than ever before. It was full now, brimming with a new kind of purpose and a love that filled every corner. Lucas surprised her on Christmas Eve. He had hired a photographer from a town 2 days away. The man set up his camera and took pictures of their new family. There were photos of Clara and Lucas, of each twin alone, and all 4 of them together. "So we can remember this," Lucas told her. "So they will always know how much they were loved, right from the start." Clara's eyes welled with tears. She thought of the one picture she had of her brother Thomas. Her sons would have a whole book of memories. "Thank you," she whispered. The new year, 1880, arrived. Clara thought about her life. She was 29 years old. Just 2 years ago, she was a new housekeeper thinking her life was over. 5 years ago, she was Mrs. Richard Whitmore, a failed wife in a cold marriage, defined only by the children she could not have. That woman felt like a stranger now. The woman she had become, Clara Hale, a mother and a survivor, was stronger than she had ever dreamed. The baby's cries woke her. She smiled and went to them. She picked up William while Lucas got James. They worked together like a well-practiced team. "We make a good team," Lucas said, rocking James. "The very best." That night she stood at the window looking at the snow. Lucas came and put his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking on?" he asked. "How strange life is. How I was told I was barren, worthless." She turned to face him. "And now I have 2 perfect sons. The doctors were wrong." "Or maybe," he said softly, "you were never the problem to begin with." The thought had crossed her mind before. What if Richard had been the one who could not have children? All those years of shame might have been for nothing. But it did not matter now. That old life was gone. "I am happy," she said. "For the first time, I am truly happy." Lucas kissed her brow. Then William cried out, always the first to wake. She smiled and went to him, settling into the rocking chair. The baby fed and Clara stroked his soft hair. She marveled at the miracle of him. The prairie wind howled outside, but inside all was warm and safe. Clara Hale rocked her son and counted her blessings. She had been thrown away, told she was nothing. She had arrived at the edge of the world with only her shame. And she had built this: a home, a family, a life so full of love. The impossible had happened. The broken was made whole. The woman who could not have children now had 2 sons. Spring came early that year. The twins were 7 months old, sitting up and talking their own secret language. James was a serious little fellow, studying everything he could grab. William was the smiler. These were her sons, her impossible, miraculous sons. And she was their mother. The world had been wrong. Everyone who ever doubted her was spectacularly wrong. Clara Hale was exactly where she was meant to be. Life on the ranch felt blessed. The herd was bigger, and Clara's new vegetable garden stretched out wide. They were building a real future now, not just getting by. From the porch, she heard William's new favorite word, Mama. Her heart just about burst every time. "I am right here, honey," she answered. Lucas came out with William on his hip and James scooting right behind. "Looks like you are a popular lady." She took William, who was getting heavy. Lucas smiled. "They will be walking before we know it. Then the real trouble starts." Just then, James grabbed her skirt and pulled himself up, swaying but proud, a big grin on his face. In that simple moment, with the big Wyoming sky above them, Clara felt a peace so deep it almost hurt, the 4 of them together. But that perfect peace was broken 2 weeks later. Clara was working bread dough when a wagon pulled up. Folks did not just drop by out here. The rig was pulled by fine horses, but the woman driving looked like she had seen hard miles. Clara's heart stopped. She knew that posture. She knew it was her mother. Marianne Whitmore had come all the way to Wyoming. Clara watched, frozen, as the older woman climbed down, moving slow and stiff. Her hair was almost all gray, her face carved with lines Clara had never seen. Then came the knock, sharp and certain, a sound from a different life. She opened the door. They stood there with years of silence between them. "Clara," Marianne finally said, her voice just as crisp as ever. "May I come in?" Clara did not speak. She just stepped aside and pointed toward the kitchen. Marianne came in, her eyes taking in the room. Clara took in the whole scene, the simple, clean room, the twin boys playing on a blanket. It was a life so different from the one she had been forced to leave. "You have children," Marianne said, her voice thin. It was not a question. "Twins," Clara replied. "James and William. They are 8 months old." Marianne looked down at the boys, who stared back with the same serious expression. They looked healthy. They are perfectly healthy. The doctors were wrong about everything. Marianne sank into a kitchen chair, the long journey having worn her down to a nub. She looked frail. "I came to tell you that your father passed away," she said, just like that. 3 months ago. Pneumonia. Clara waited for a wave of grief, but it never came. He had been a stranger for years. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it in a distant way. "He left nothing," Marianne continued, her hands twisting in her lap. "There were debts. The house had to be sold. Everything is gone. I have been staying with your cousin Margaret," she said, "but I cannot stay there much longer. I have nowhere else to go." The meaning behind her visit finally dawned on Clara, followed by a hot flash of anger. "You came here to ask me for help," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I was your daughter 5 years ago when you sent me away. I was your daughter when you told me I had failed at the one thing that mattered." Her voice grew louder, escaping her control. "Where was your duty as a mother then?" Marianne flinched. "I know I failed you. I was wrong. I am here now, begging for a chance to make it right. By showing up on my doorstep when you have no other choice? That is not making things right, Mother. That is desperation." "Yes," Marianne's voice broke. "It is desperation. I am frightened and alone, and you are all I have left." At that moment, William crawled over to Marianne's chair. He pulled himself up on her skirt and looked up at her with big, curious eyes, babbling a little question. Marianne looked down at him, and her whole face seemed to crumble. "He looks like Thomas," she whispered. "Around the eyes." Clara's anger began to fade. She had often thought the same thing about her late brother, but had never said it out loud. "Thomas would have been a wonderful uncle," Clara said quietly. "He would have loved them." "He would have loved you better than I did," Marianne said, reaching out to touch William's soft hair. "I was taught that a woman's worth was in her home and her children. When we thought you could not have any, I did not know how to value you. I should have learned. I did not." The confession just hung there in the quiet room. "Why now?" Clara asked. "Why come all this way to tell me this?" "Because losing everything taught me what is important. Because I am 62 years old and I have wasted so much time. And I am afraid," her voice broke completely. "I am afraid I will die before I can tell you I'm sorry. That I was wrong. That you deserved so much better." The wounds felt old and scarred over. But then James crawled over to join his brother at Marianne's knee. The two of them looked up at her, a united front of curious babies. They had never known any grandparents. The door opened and Lucas came inside, stopping short when he saw the stranger at his table. "Lucas, this is my mother, Marianne Whitmore. Mother, this is my husband, Lucas Hale." Lucas's expression grew hard. He had heard all the stories about Clara's family. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped. You have a beautiful family, Marianne said, her hands trembling. Clara looks happy. She is happy. We both are, Lucas said, moving to stand beside Clara like a solid wall. What brings you to Wyoming? The question was polite, but the real meaning was clear. What do you want here? She came to tell me my father died, Clara said, and to ask for help. Lucas's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, ready to support whatever his wife decided. Else. Clara watched them, these children who had changed everything she believed about herself. What would she want them to know about family? About forgiveness? You can stay, Clara heard her own voice say. For now. We can work out the details later. Marianne's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Clara. I am not doing this for you, Clara said plainly. I am doing it because my sons deserve to know their grandmother, and because I will not become you. I will not close doors on family. I understand, Marianne whispered. Do you? Clara stepped closer. Because I need you to be clear. I am not a failure. I built this life myself. I have a husband who loves me and children who need me. I do not need your approval. I never did. I know, Marianne said. I can see that. You are stronger than I ever was. Then act like it, Clara said, or this will not work. Marianne was put in the same small room she had used as a housekeeper, a bitter pill for her to swallow. She was all thumbs with ranch chores, having only ever told others what to do. But with the twin boys, she was a godsend. She had a gentle way with them, singing old lullabies and telling them stories of their family. One evening she told Clara, "Your daddy always said you were born with an old soul." Marianne confessed they were both so afraid of loving wrong that they hardly loved at all. Slowly, she began to find her place, learning to cook for Lucas and to be helpful without getting in the way. Then one afternoon, Clara found her in the garden, pulling weeds with hands that clearly weren't used to the dirt. Clara told her to leave the weeds be. Marianne shook her head, saying she had to think on her future, that she could not just live off their kindness forever. She heard the school in Redemption was looking for a teacher. Clara was taken aback, picturing her high society mother in a simple frontier school. Marianne's smile was sad. That world is gone, she said. I have to earn my keep now, a lesson you learned 5 years ago. I reckon I'm just now catching up. Clara helped her get the position, and Marianne was hired 2 weeks later. She visited the ranch every Sunday, and soon became a welcome sight for the boys. Clara watched her mother change into someone stronger, someone more real. One Sunday, the two women sat on the porch watching Lucas play with the twins, who were now 1 year old. He is a wonderful man, Marianne said quietly. Do you love him? The question was blunt, not her mother's usual way. Clara considered it. Yes, this is different than with Richard. Lucas sees every part of me and loves me because of it, not in spite of it. Marianne sighed. That is the kind of love you only read about in books. A moment later, she turned to Clara. I need to tell you something. I wrote to Richard. She pulled a letter from her pocket. He wrote back. I believe you should see this. Richard's handwriting was as perfect as she recalled. The letter was cold and distant. He wrote that he was surprised by the news of her children, figuring the Philadelphia doctors must have been wrong. He said their marriage was a poor match from the start, and that he had since remarried someone more suitable. He finished by saying he held no ill will toward Clara. She read it over, but the old anger and hurt were gone. All she felt was pity. She learned he now had a daughter of his own. The irony of it all, that he could father a child after all, was almost funny. I am happy for him, Clara said, and she meant it. He deserves a life that is neat and orderly. Do you regret it? Marianne asked. Clara looked out at her husband and sons, at the wide-open prairie that was her home. I regret the pain I felt, she said, but I could never regret the path that brought me here. It gave me everything that truly matters. Her mother squeezed her hand. You are an extraordinary woman, Clara. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. On their second anniversary, as they sat by the fire, Lucas asked, "Are you happy?" "Impossibly so," she whispered. He told her he thanked his lucky stars every single day that she came to Wyoming. Then he spoke of expanding the ranch, of buying the grazing land to the north. It was ambitious, a big gamble, but Clara knew it was the right thing to do. "I think we should build something that lasts," she said. Lucas's smile was as bright as the morning sun. "And that is what we will do," he promised. Over the next year, they worked hard, buying the land and growing the herd. By the spring of 1882, the ranch was thriving, and they had hired 2 hands to help. It was then that Clara realized she was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear inside her, only a deep and quiet joy. "Another baby," Lucas said, his voice filled with pure wonder. "Another miracle," he said with wonder. "Or maybe just us," she replied. The pregnancy went smoothly this time. Clara felt strong and capable. The twin boys loved patting her growing belly. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" James always asked. "We will not know until the baby arrives," Clara would say. "I hope it is a boy," William declared. "So we can teach him things." He thought for a moment. "If it is a girl, we will teach her things too." Clara laughed and hugged them close. The baby, a girl they named Catherine Rose, was born in late November during the first snowfall. The birth was easier than with the twins. "She is perfect," Marianne whispered, holding her new granddaughter for the first time. The baby was dark-haired like her brothers, but had Clara's fine features. "Our daughter," Lucas said, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I never imagined this." With 3 children running around, the house was feeling a bit snug, which was a fine problem to have. Lucas was already sketching out plans for an addition. That old version of Clara, the one who came to Wyoming with nothing but dust in her pockets, felt like a character in a book she once read. She was a rancher now, a wife, and a mother. She had stared down impossible odds and won. So, on a crisp October morning in 1884, she decided it was time. She drove the wagon to Redemption, bought herself some nice paper and ink, and sat down at a friend's table to write a letter. It began simply. "Dear Richard, I hear from my mother that you are doing well and have a new family. I am truly glad for you. I am writing to you because I owe you my thanks. Not for our marriage, which was a mistake, but for ending it. By casting me aside, you gave me the freedom to find a life I never could have imagined. I have 3 children now, twin boys who are 5 years old and a daughter who turns 3 this November. My husband values me for who I am. I have a prosperous ranch here in Wyoming, work that fills my days with purpose and good neighbors who respect me. This life would never have happened if you had not found me lacking. Your rejection was my liberation. So, thank you, Richard. Thank you for being the man you were, because it made me become the woman I am. I hold no anger toward you. I hope you find your own happiness. Sincerely, Clara Hale." She sealed and mailed the letter, feeling a heavy weight lift from her shoulders. It did not matter if he ever read it. That letter was not for him. It was for her. She was closing her own door. On the ride home, Clara pulled the wagon over on a high ridge that overlooked the ranch. From up there, she could see it all. The bigger house with 2 chimneys smoking, the barn Lucas built, and the corrals full of livestock. She saw Lucas in the yard, chasing their 2 boys, James and William, while little Catherine toddled right behind them. She could hear their laughter on the wind. This was her place in the world. She had not inherited it or married into it. She had built it with her own 2 hands in a stubborn refusal to be what others said she was. The doctors had called her barren, but she had 3 beautiful children. Her first husband had called her worthless, but she now ran a thriving ranch. The woman who came to Wyoming thinking her life was over had found it was only just beginning. As she drove down the slope toward home, her son William spotted her. "Mama's home!" he yelled, and her little family all turned to see her. Lucas gave her that slow, easy smile she loved. Marianne came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron, and called out that supper was nearly on the table. Clara climbed down and scooped Catherine into a hug. With Lucas's hand resting warmly on her back, she guided her boys toward the house. This beautiful noise, this wonderful chaos, this was her life. This unbelievable second chance had turned out to be her true beginning. The prairie wind blew, carrying the smell of autumn. Inside, Clara settled, her family around the dinner table they had built together. She was surrounded by the children that science had sworn were impossible. Looking at their faces, she felt a peace so deep and wide it seemed to fill the whole Wyoming sky. The doctors had been wrong. The world had been wrong. Every soul who ever judged her had been spectacularly wrong. Clara Hale knew exactly what she was worth now, and it was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.